It might not survive this winter night. You walked carefully on the muddy ground, and your boots crunched under the frost from the hut. The room was pitch-dark, with only a few pieces of wood in the center of the fireplace struggling to burn, emitting a faint light. The smoke slowly curled upwards, or at least tried to gather under the low rafters, as the holes in the roof were not very easy to inhale. Your cough, your eyes are stinging. For a moment, you may wonder if sleeping outdoors is more breathable. However, for the farmers in the Middle Ages, this was what was called warmth. When archaeologists were studying well-preserved medieval houses in England and Scandinavia, they discovered beams blackened by soot, proving that these houses also served as chimneys. This is a fact in daily life. If you want heat, you have to live in smoke. Scholars still disagree that continuous inhalation of smoke has a greater impact on lung diseases than on parasite control, as smoke does kill some insects. You looked around and found that the walls were intact and the branches on the door were smeared with mud. They look very sturdy, but in fact every crack in them is expelling cold air. You stretch out your hand and touch it with your palm, and you will feel that the hard shell is almost frozen. A thin stream of air winds down your sleeve. The building regulations of the Middle Ages did not include insulation materials. All you have is soil, straw and prayers. However, you still noticed his efforts to go home, and their herbs hung above the fireplace to dry, and their fragrance was faint in the smoke. A rough wooden cross was leaning against the corner. There are several jars patched with lead strips beside the shelf. You squatted beside the fire, stretching out your hands, but the warmth vanished as soon as it touched your skin. No wonder every household goes to bed very early, since lying together can at least preserve some heat, or waste time on waking up in the cold. Have you ever thought about the fragility of these nights? Wolves were wandering at the edge of the village. Sometimes thieves target doors with only wooden latches. Darkness itself is terrifying. In winter, nights last for 14 hours or longer. Imagine being trapped in a smoke-filled box for so long. Perhaps this is why people have turned bedtime into a common thing. The family members sang, told stories, prayed and observed a moment of silence together before falling asleep. A strange gossip story, the records of the memorial court occasionally mention fines for excessive noise at night, which indicates that even farmers would complain about noisy neighbors through thin walls. Obviously, even in the depth of winter, rural life in the Middle Ages would be very noisy. Where you were sitting by the fireplace, you noticed that frost had formed inside the thatched roof. Sometimes it will melt into small water droplets and fall on your back like cold needles. The children were skipping and jumping on the ground barefoot, carefree. Their feet had become hard because of their life close to the ground. They dived under a pile of straw where the blanket was waiting. Before a large number of corpses warmed them up, they screamed in the cold. Of course you were invited. A hand waved from the dark corner. You hesitate. You love your modern bed so much, but curiosity overcomes everything. You dragged your feet over and looked down at the bed. It was nearly a raised wooden platform leaning against the wall, with a pile of straw, shrapnelled wool bats and patch trunks placed on it. However, in this dim little house, it is the center of life. This is the place where you sleep, eat, chat, take care of patients, and even give birth. In winter, it becomes your refuge. You slid down, feeling the creaking of the straw beneath your feet, stinging your skin. You understood. Although it's uncomfortable, this is survival. Every frost outside and the howling wind are reminding you of how thin the line between warmth and cold is. You will be distracted. How many such winters can a farmer endure? Historical records show that the mortality rate in winter is very high, especially for infants and the elderly. However, families have persisted in their lives with extraordinary resilience. Some historians believe that farmers merely accepted suffering as part of God's plan, while others think that they formulated coping strategies that we underestimate. The argument continues, but tonight, lying on the straw under the smoke-filled roof, you will feel pain and tenacity intertwined. Your eyelids became heavy as the embers from the fireplace gradually turned pale orange. You can still hear the low gurgling of the livestock outside. For safety, they are kept near the hut. They will soon join you in it. But you realize that this is another layer of survival in winter. Because now you lie quietly, listening to the bone-minus chilling frost dripping, the hissing of smoke, and the steady breathing of the people around you. You know the long winter night has just begun. You wake up in the hazy morning light, feeling something sting your cheek. It was a straw, rough and coarse, sticking out of a rough linen bag. You shift your center of gravity and hear the rustling sound of withered leaves being crushed. Suddenly, you realize there are dozens of small movements over your feet. Fleas, lice, mites. Your skin will itch before you truly feel them. Welcome to the medieval bed. Most farmers do not have wooden frames or soft mattresses. What you have is a bag of straw, sometimes stuffed with hay, reeds, or even moss, if the situation is critical. It is called the Paleolithic age. Every few months, every household changes the fillings because after a season, the fillings become fat and damp, filled with small creatures. Imagine lying in bed at night, having been tickled until you feel sleepy. This is the reality of daily life. Here is a mainstream fact. Medieval documents and later records describe these straw mattresses as standard furniture for poor European families. In some places, wealthier farmers might add a thin wool sheet, but in most cases, straw is packed in sacks. Yes, historians are still debating whether these sacks were laced directly on the floor or on rough wooden frames. The evidence unearthed in different regions varies. The houses in the Scandinavian peninsula show simple raised platforms, while the farmhouses in the UK show bedding directly laid on the ground. You rolled over and the straw pierced your shoulder again. A pungent smell was initially sweetened and sour, as the damp straw soon got moldy. You wrinkled your nose, wondering how anyone could fall asleep here. However, people were exhausted from dawn to dusk, working in the fields or workshops. Fatigue overcame discomfort, and the bodies huddled together masked the most unpleasant smell. A strange gossip story. Some records mention that farmers use chaff, and the chaff left of threshing grains is used as mattress filling. It is rich, free, but unfortunately sharp. Imagine sleeping in a bag filled with razor-shaped fragments. It's not a luxurious memory bubble, but when your choice is a sharp shell or cold soil, you learn to be grateful. When you settle down, you will notice how noisy Straw Island is. Every movement is a declaration. Creaking, crunching, sighing. The children's tossing and turning will cause a rustling sound. Of course, privacy does not exist, but the sound landscape of medieval nights is a thing in itself. The brook, snoring, whispers, the scratching of animals and the continuous creaking of straw make up the lullaby of this village. Close your eyes and think about how modern people use beds as shelters. However, here, the bed is more of a functional piece of land, sufficient to separate you from the cold of the earth. Comfort is not the goal. Survival, you don't know if your back can survive this season, must be very common. In the Middle Ages, there were even methods to treat joint stiffness caused by lying down, usually including hot compresses with herbs. Scholars sometimes debate whether poor posture and hard bed shorten working life, but some believe that endless farm labor is the culprit. Suddenly, an itchy sensation climbed up your arm. This is not what you imagined. Bedbugs were already a plague of the Middle Ages long before they became the horror story of modern hotels. Herbs like royal flowers, peonies and absinthe far burned or stuffed under straw to repel them, although their effects are questionable. Some farmers deliberately swag in bed and hang sacks over the fireplace to kill pests. As a result, the bedding smelled like a campfire, which was much better than insect infestation. In the corner, an old woman muttered that she wanted to change her straw tomorrow. What she meant was to take the entire mattress apart, throw out the moldy chaff and stuff the fresh debris into a sack. This job usually falls on women and children. Although it is dirty and messy, it is indispensable. Neglected straw beds may breed rotten diseases. A historical fact shows that hospitals and temples also rely on straw bedding, which is regularly replaced as part of a hygiene routine. This wisdom is well known. You moved again, and a small snowflake of wheat straw fell on your face. You sneezed and scared the child beside you. The child giggled and pulled the blanket higher. At that moment, despite the fleas, itching and mold, you still felt a strange comfort. This pile of thorny straw doesn't mean comfort, but it is warm when it is crowded with corpses. This is very familiar. This is a family. However, your modern thinking still cannot fully accept it. You long for spring water, feathers, memory foam, anything that can't crawl. But the reality is that fathers endure night after night, year after year, trying to wake up, stretch their bodies and then return to work. When you lie in bed and scratch absent-mindedly, you will realize how elastic each straw of this bed is. You sighed, your breathing clearly visible in the cold air. Listening to the rustling of the straw, everyone settled down again, waiting for true sleep to come. You move in the straw, still itchy by the ghost crawling on your skin, and then you realize something else. There is no bed for you at all. It's not allowed in the small house. The whole family slept together on a wide and drooping platform. You are now being pressed between your shoulders, knees and elbows, and occasionally there is a pointed little heel of a child who dreams of kicking his leg. Forget it. In the life of medieval peasants, bedtime was public, crowded and filled with purely necessary intimate relationships. The air is filled with the warmth brought by breathing together. Every inhalation carries the smell of wool, smoke and earth. And with each exhalation, the clouds vanished in a chilly manner. The walls are too thin to hold heat, so the only reliable heater is meat to meat. You turned your head and bumped your nose with the child. She giggled and then crawled under a patched blanket. You feel someone else's rough hand resting on your arm. It might be the grandfather or the elder brother. You still left. Everyone relies on others. A mainstream historical fact is that in most parts of medieval Europe, the entire family shared one sleeping space, usually a raised bed or a large pile of bedding. Court records and folk tales confirm this, depicting a family huddled together. This approach is not merely cultural. This is survival. In a house where the temperature is crunched to freezing, especially in Northern Europe, you won't waste calories sleeping alone. Even wealthy farmers with more space usually squeeze multiple people onto one bed. As your body adjusts, you will notice how meticulously your sleep sequence is arranged. The children work closest to the middle, with adults blocking them on both sides. Sometimes babies sleep on their mother's chests, wrapped up tightly, looking more like a loaf of bread than a baby. Grandparents are usually placed on the colder edge, because young people need warmth more urgently. As you can see, this simple arrangement not only kept everyone alive, but also strengthened family bonds. However, scholars still have differences on the details. Do family members always sleep in a strict order? Is it still the habit of varying by region? Some people believe that the structured sleep grades proposed in the text might be a moral exaggeration by clergy, and they do not approve of so much physical intimacy. Others say that evidence from archaeology and folk tales points to a very practical temperature positioning system. The argument continues, and you, lying here, with the stranger's knee against your rib, suspect that the answer might be a combination of both. A strange behind minus the minus scenes story will make you giggle. Medieval jokes often made fun of farmers' overly crowded beds. In some verses, a man claims that he and his wife, children, servants and dogs all sleep on the same mattress. A medieval stand-up comedy routine. Obviously, even at that time, people would find humor in such a crowded bed because you had to struggle for space at your elbows. You'll lay on your back, staring at the blackened rafters above, feeling a heavy burden on your stomach. A toddler climbs onto you, twisting and turning until he finds a comfortable hole beside your buttocks. His hair had a faint smell of smoke, and perhaps also of yogurt. He sighed contentedly and dozed off in a daze. You will understand that this was very practical for farmers in the Middle Ages. This is an emotional sense of security. Children won't sleep alone in the cold corner. They sleep in the hearts of their family members. But this close relationship also has its tense aspects. Imagine that after a long day, you lie shoulder to shoulder with your family, snoring, body movement, and occasional hiccups because yes, everyone eats beans. The beans did their work as part of the night's soundtrack. You can't hide your anger. You just endure, tease or laugh, and then endure again. You heard a heavy and loud cough coming from the other end of the bed. An old man's chest gave off a sound of aging and coldness. The disease spread rapidly in these small rooms. If a child brings home a winter fever, the whole family will be lying shoulder to shoulder in an infectious disease. In medieval villages, the mortality rates of influenza, pneumonia, and even the common cold were all very high. At that time, doctors sometimes attributed the cause to the foul air rising from the ground, while priests blamed sin and God's punishment. But the actual situation is very simple. There are too many corpses and too little ventilation. There is no concept of bacteria at all. The room gradually took on a rhythm. Some people snore for a long time intermittently. His mother's whisper calmed him down. You close your eyes again, trying to relax under the pressure of your body, and find yourself thinking about what this means for people's self-awareness. Modern life values individuality. You have your own bed, your own space, and your own sleep. But here, the self is blurred into the group. Your warmth depends entirely on others. Perhaps this has cultivated resilience, or perhaps it has bred a sense of frustration. Historians are still debating whether collective sleep strengthened family unity or created potential tensions that we can only guess about. Your feet touched something warm and fluffy. For a moment, you wished startled and thought it was an animal, because it was very likely an animal. But that was not the case. It was just a sheepskin covering the bed. However, reminders still exist. In this world, the boundaries between humans and beasts, the inner and the outer, are blurred. Before long, livestock will even come in to share the warmth, just as they often do. But now it was just a family huddled together, breathing as the pale clouds rose and the straw rustled beneath. You also notice the rhythm of breathing together. This chorus of inhalation and exhalation has a strange sense of relaxation. You feel that your chest is the same as theirs, as if your lungs have been pulled into a choir. You wonder if this synchronization gave medieval sleepers a deeper sense of connection, or if it merely meant that everyone would wake up whenever someone turned over. Perhaps both are present. Another sneeze shook the entire room. A child rubbed his nose with his sleeve. You remember the book said that snort is a constant in winter, almost its own season. There weren't old tissues. You wiped on anything at hand, wool, straw, your neighbor's corset, and no one blinked. Life is chaotic, public and intimate. The longer you lie in bed, the more you will realize that a family bed does not mean romance or luxury. It means survival. This means that the corpses were piled up like firewood, enduring the scorching and fatal nights outside. You imagine snowflakes piling up on the door. Wolves howled in the distance, and frost spread within the walls. And here you are, trapped among snoring relatives, safe, uncomfortable, yes, but still alive. Perhaps you think that modern people underestimate the preciousness of that warmth. When you have nothing but straw, tattered blankets, and the warmth of your own kind, you hold them tightly, not because you want them, but because you have to. In this case, perhaps, there is another kind of comfort. You sighed in the darkness, scratched your arm again, and let the murmuring gradually fade away. Sleep pulled you back once more. Somewhere in the corner, the fire in the stove coughed up the last spark, and the room plunged into a deeper night. Breathed together, a fragile organism waiting for dawn. The fire turned into a pile of burning coal, and the hut seemed darker than before. Your nose is twitching. There is a smell in the air that you haven't noticed before. The pungent smell of animal musk mixed with feces and damp wool. At first, you think it drifted in from outside, but when you look back, you will realize the truth. A goat walks slowly into the door, followed by a pig sniffing the straw. You are no longer just sharing a bed with your family. Tonight, livestock are also crawling in. This may seem shocking, but for many medieval farmers, it was common sense. The existing records come from memorial accounts in the Yule-Cain tax registers in some regions of France. These records indicate that most families own animals, which could be a cow, a pig, a few chickens, or a sheep or a goat. These wild beasts represent wealth and survival, as well as milk, wool, meat and fertilizer for farmland. To protect them from theft and the cold, the family often invites them into the house. If a house has only one room, it means that people and animals sleep together. Lunch does not refresh. The pig sighed and plopped into the straw. Its warmth immediately spread out. It's not elegant, but you can't deny its benefits. The body heat produced by an adult cow is more than that of several people combined. Some historians stress that this practice helped farmers maintain tolerable indoor temperatures during the harshest winters. Others, however, pointed out its drawbacks, such as diseases, dirtiness, and the danger of being frequently stepped on by hooves at night. There are differences in the consensus of the academic community. Is this a smart adaptation or a desperate compromise? Perhaps both occur simultaneously. There is a strange little custom worth noting. That is, some villages in the Alps give the cattle at home an nickname, stove cow, because its existence is as valuable as the fire itself. She doesn't just give milk. She exuded a steady warmth, just like a living stove. The chronicles of the 15th century recorded that families would wrap their children in blankets and place them directly beside cows, so that their little bodies could absorb the heat from the cows. Lying in the straw, you begin to understand why. The goat presses on your feet and you feel warm. Despite numerous difficulties, it is almost comfortable. However, this is not idyllic either. The goat sneezes, soaking you all over. Pigs spur louder than anyone else, humming and moving. Its smell is pungent and will make your stomach feel sick. Fleas will jump from an animal's fur to a person's hair without hesitation. In spring, when the animals are giving birth indoors, you will sleep beside a screaming piglet or calf and struggle to stand up for the first time. The boundary between the farmhouse courtyard and the bedroom became blurred until it completely vanished. Imagine the soundscape. The chicken cackled and rustled in the corner. The room was filled with the heavy breathing of the cow, the clinking sound of horse hooves on the muddy ground. Add to that your grandfather's cough, your siblings' whispers, and the occasional cracking sounds, and you have a symphony of rural survival. Sleep does not come from silence but from exhaustion. Despite the noise, your body finally gave in. When archaeologists were excavating medieval houses in the Scandinavian peninsula, they discovered that in some British farmhouses, animal enclosures were directly built inside the houses, with only low wooden partitions separating the animals from the humans. The evidence shows that there are no obstacles at all. These animals actually live in the same space. Researchers still have differences over the prevalence of this practice. Some people believe that this practice is almost universal among the poor, while others think that it varies by climate and is adopted more frequently in colder regions. The debate continues due to the lack of precise evidence. But tonight, in your imagination, there is no doubt. Your nose doesn't match that of a goat at all. But your hand touched something damp. You recoil. The pig left you a small gift in the straw. This is also part of life. Every household scatters feces every morning, sometimes directly in the fields. The bedding and feces you sleep on it can all be used to fertilize your crops. Waste has never been true waste. However, when you wipe your hands on the tattered blanket, you can't help but think that modern hygiene concepts might not survive here. The existence of animals is not merely for keeping warm. This is also related to safety. Thieves wander around in the severe winter. Stealing a pig or a cow might sustain a family's livelihood. Bringing animals indoors can ensure their safety. Some medieval laws even stipulated fines for stealing livestock at night, which implies how common this crime was. Sleeping beside a cow, you can not only keep warm but also stand guard. There is another layer of friendship. Chroniclers occasionally mention farmers' feelings towards their livestock. A woman might hum a song to her cow. Children might hold the lamb as if it were a pet. On such a long and cold night, perhaps the comfort of another warm body, or even an animal, is worth it. Even though your judgment was rather wise, you still felt a hint of gratitude. But this is not without risks. Diseases can be transmitted from animals to humans, although people do not understand the modern sense of infection. What they said was not a bad air or a curse. Later research has shown that animal infectious diseases like tuberculosis may spread under such circumstances. As farmers are already facing so many other hazards, some experts still disagree on how destructive these cross-species infections are. But lying here and coughing into the smoke-filled air, you can imagine the price of health. The pig moved again, pressing its heavy body down on you. Suddenly, you felt warmer than you had all night. You sighed, allowing the heat to seep into your bones, even if the smell made your eyes water. Survival often requires you to choose comfort over pride. You realize that in this cramped little house, with family on one side and livestock on the other, the farmers have found a balance. They endure filth, for otherwise they would suffer from frostbite and death. The night is getting longer. The snow outside was gently lapping against the thatched roof. The cow was pacing. Your sister snores. The flame went out. You are wrapped in a tapestry woven from the lives of humans and animals, which are interwoven by necessity. Raise the blanket a little at the spot where you are scratching the fleas, and let the rough symphony lull you back to sleep. When you go resting for the first time, you won't doubt whether these farmers are disguising themselves, or if they have merely accepted this strange, intimate relationship as a way of the world. Perhaps both are present. Anyway, winter was still going on and the animals all stayed together. As the night grew darker, you increasingly realized how fragile each layer of protection was. The wind was blowing through the entire wall, sticking your fingers out of the cracks. Instinctively, you carried something coarser and heavier on your shoulders. It was made by piecing together fur wool fragments and rags, so many times that the original fragments were no longer visible. You curled up beneath it, feeling grateful, even though you felt the hard seam scraping against your chin. This is a world of medieval coverings that is more precious than luxury goods. The list of items that survived from rural families shows that blankets and furs are usually the most precious possessions. When property is divided, simple woolen bed sheets may be listed together with pots and tools, because the production cost of textiles is high and they are passed down from generation to generation. For poorer families, a blanket might meet all their needs. In the modern sense, the word quilt is rarely seen. The feeling on you is more like a pile of things that can keep you warm. Sometimes it's sheepskin, sometimes old clothes sewn into larger cloth, and sometimes real rags pieced together. If you move your weight a little, the blanket will slip off, revealing a rough patch of fur. It has a faint smell of smoke, mutton fat and sweat. However, the heat it absorbs is undeniable. Unlike linen, what can remain insulating even when it gets damp. The farmers knew this. They spun all the coarse wool they could collect into thread for weaving. Some wealthier farmers might even exchange dyed cloth, although the pattern blue are out of reach for most people. Your blanket is a blend of brown, grey and faded earth tones of green. This is a survival rather than a fashion. A peculiar detail mentioned in the 14th century chronicle is that villagers sometimes stuffed their quilts with straw or reading materials, effectively turning the blankets into soft cushions. Imagine the rustling sound every time you move, just like sleeping in a scarecrow. It's not soft, but it increases the distance between one's skin and the bone chilling cold a little. You pulled your blanket tighter, hoping not to hear the storm like murmur inside. You will remember that these are not just functional items. They carry the weight of emotions. A mother's blanket might be passed on to her altering than to her granddaughter. Paces is telling family stories. One was taken from a shabby corset, and the other was taken from an old apron. Every tattered seam is sewn with memories. You may not have silver or land, but you have warmth, which is very important. Eh. Someone was muttering to themselves in their sleep, pulling the blanket and wanting more money. You felt the familiar tug of war, and suddenly your toes were exposed to the cold air. This phenomenon of quarreling every night over sharing a blanket was so common, but even medieval jokes mentioned that it's better to marry for a blanket than for love. There is a poem that playfully implies that warmth might be more persuasive than romance. But there is also a darker side. The chronicler noticed the dispute over the stolen textiles. A blanket is very valuable and may be pornographic or stolen. Sometimes the memorial court punishes villagers for taking others' blankets. The fact that these cases appear in legal records proves how important these rough levels are. Without them, no one dares to risk the winter. Experts cannot reach an agreement on whether two families of genuine fur coverage or only rough wool. Archaeological discoveries show that in colder regions such as Scandinavia, sheepskin is very common and sometimes falls upside down on people who are sleeping. In warmer regions, people may make do with wearing lighter clothes. The evidence is incomplete, leaving room for interpretation. However, lying beneath this pile of smoky rags and animal skins, you don't need an academic conclusion. You only know the difference between trembling and survival. Her nose smelled a faint odor again. Lavender. It's surprising but not impossible in this smoke-filled little house. Sometimes herbs are sewn into the lid to repel insects or enhance the fragrance. Women dry a bunch in the sun in summer and then stuff them into their winter bedding. It's not certain whether it can really stop fleas, but its smell brings comfort. You took a deep breath, grateful for even a hint of sweetness in the heavy air. You will think of those noble houses with thick tapestries hanging on the walls to block the through wind, and beds covered with velvet, silk and imported furs. In contrast, your tattered coals look pitiful. However, the nobles also complained about the cold. Their stone rooms were even colder than the smoke-filled cottages of the peasants. Whether rich or poor, no one can truly escape the invasion of the medieval winter. The only difference lies in the softness of the things you wrap around yourself. The pig beside you moved unsnorted, and your blanket slipped again. Unwilling to lose the only barrier against frost. A goat stared curiously at the corner, and you took it away. Even animals know the value of cloth in such cold weather. The thought of protecting the blanket from being bitten by goats in the middle of the night made you smile. A child rolled closer and pressed down beside you. Instinctively, you shared the quilt. This is how it works. A blanket was draped over many people, each pulling and each giving in. Although warmth is unevenly distributed, it is at least shared. At those moments, survival was a collective negotiation, just like the seams of your tattered quilt, tightly sewn together. Outside, the wind was howling and the wooden latch on the door was rattling. Snowflakes silently piled up on the threshold. But inside, beneath the patched wool and the fur soaked in smoke, you have to endure. You scratched the crevice, smelled the mutton fat again, and then sank deeper into the straw. The blanket is scraping, the air is biting, but warmth is gathering, and that's enough. You can't help but wonder if, in their restless dreams, farmers have ever imagined down beds, soft linen, or warm rooms. Or perhaps, after enduring a long winter, they accepted the fact that patched rags and stubborn were not failure of that family, the kind of durable comfort that keeps them alive. The fire now had nothing left, only a dark red glow swallowed by the ashes. You will notice that the chill will soon return. You instinctively moved towards the fireplace, even though it only gave off a hint of warmth. Your eyes follow the curling smoke that refuses to leave. Trapped beneath the rafters, floating above the room like a ghost. You coughed a few times into your sleeve. Only then did you realize that the smoke-filled fireplace was both your greatest comfort and your eternal enemy. Evidence found in the excavated hut indicates that the fireplace is precisely located in the center of the floor, with no chimney, only a hole in the roof or wall. Neatly framed with bricks and flues, is a luxury that most farmers have never had before. Instead, the flames burned low and smoke filled the room, often until the beams were blackened. Archaeologists can still witness the scene centuries later. Cigarette ash remained on the wood like surviving fingerprints. The embers you see are all carefully allocated logs. Firewood is always inexhaustible. In fact, written complaints from the Middle Ages show that farmers who illegally felled timber in the Lord's forest would be fined. Wood rights are strictly controlled, so every branch burned in the fireplace is precious. You understand why fire is allowed to be extinguished into embers. It takes discipline to spread fuel during the long winter night. A peculiar story emerged in folk tales. Some families bury the embers under the ashes before going to bed and carefully cover them up, so that the coal will smolder until the morning. They call it the sleeping fire. The next morning they shook it awake with dried twigs and woke it up without using flint. Imagine seeing those faint red sparks still alive at dawn. It's a kind of relief. Tonight, if you squat a little closer and gently push the ashes with a stick, you will understand why people regard fire as a living companion. But reality is cruel. The smoke stuns your eyes, making them shed tears constantly. It gets stuck in your throat, scratching you like grains of sand. Medieval doctors' records described chronic cough, catarrh, and other diseases that we now consider to be smoke inhalation injuries. Nowadays, some experts believe that long-term exposure to these small houses can shorten one's lifespan, especially for women and children who stay indoors for longer periods. Others, however, believe that, ironically, smoking has some benefits. It can fumigate houses, prevent insects, and even slow down the decay of thatched roofs. The academic debate is still ongoing. But you don't need data to tell you that this is suffocating. You narrowed your eyes, tears streaming down your face, imagining what impact this situation would have on your lungs over the years. Fire is never just for keeping warm. It cooks every meal, every cup of coffee, and illuminates every dark moment. Without it, you have nothing. Every household guards their embers as if they were treasures. In fact, it is recorded that neighbors borrowed live coal from each other. If their own fires went out, they would carry the coal in earthenware jars overnight. The competition doesn't exist. Flint and steel can be fickle, so losing the fireplace means panic. Imagine you stumble in the snow to your neighbor's door, holding a clay pot in your hand and praying that there is still a pile of coal glowing inside them. This is an interesting little detail of some villages. The children were asked to whisper incantations to the embers before going to sleep, praying for the fire to sleep well and wake up brightly. Whether out of superstition or for comfort, this ritual incorporates the fireplace as part of the family. Listening to the faint smoke and the occasional cracking of wood, you can see how natural this intimate relationship with fire is. You stretch out your hands towards that light. The heat is very weak, but even hallucinations can help you relax. The orange light casts shadows on the wall, strange shapes, looking almost alive. You will recall all the winter nights when farmers sat quietly, watching the equally ever-changing light, allowing their thoughts to wander. Perhaps they whisper stories or pray in a low voice, or just stare until they fall asleep. However, fireplaces are dangerous. Sparks sometimes jump onto the straw or rush grass covering the floor, and the hut may catch fire within minutes. The entire village was in danger because each household had a box of firewood. Medieval town regulations often require that fires be stored or extinguished at night. Therefore, the origin of the term curfew is K, which means to cover the fire. However, in the small houses in the countryside, no one enforced it. When you sleep, believe that embers won't betray you. The pig was startled by the crackling sound of the fire and snorted from the other end of the room. A child moved a little, rubbed his eyes, and then rolled towards a warm place. Cover yourself with a blanket higher and breathe gently to avoid inhaling the smoke. The fireplace may be fading, but its function is clear. It is the fragile heart of this one-room world, fragile and changeable, yet indispensable. Imagine waking up at dawn, stirring the embers with pliers, adding small twigs and coaxing the flames. The family will get together to have porridge or bread. All of this is because of this tiny survival engine. Without it, there would be no cooked food, no safe drink, and no warmth at all. You know how much people trust such unstable things, right? Experts still disagree on whether medieval peasants truly regarded fire as sacred or merely necessary. Some anthropologists believe that rituals, prayers, and punishments prove reverence. Others warn that actual These often explain what worship is. When you sit here and gaze at the light, you feel these two sensations. Fire is necessary, but it is also a mysterious, living, dangerous, comforting and terrifying thing. The embers flickered weakly. You know, unless taken good care of, they will disappear by the next morning. You lie down again, feeling the smoke minus like warmth fade from your skin, and listen to the gentle breathing of your family and animals. Without the blazing flames, there would be no noble fireplace. But in this farmhouse, it's enough to keep you going for another night. You coughed again, your eyes stinging, and dozed off in a daze. The glow of the fireplace was your last image. You with a fragile ember, in an unfeeling winter. You stir in the straw, but the smoke still sticks to your lungs. Suddenly, you find the air a bit strange. Although the fire was almost out, it felt damp and heavy, and some places were surprisingly warm. You took a deep breath and realized what had made the difference. It is the heat of the people and animals around you, rising in the thin clouds that gather beneath the rafters. You tilted your head and saw glistening water droplets condensing on the crossbeam above, just like ice beads waiting to fall. In a world without isolation, the warmth of the body is both a comfort and a curse. Medieval observers often described winter huts as being drenched in sweat, with water vapor exhaled by people dripping onto the walls. Archaeologists studying the preserved would have even discovered mineral traces left by centuries of condensation. Imagine dozens of lungs breathing in a small room all night long. The air became damp, and then cold water droplets fell down again. You pulled the blanket higher, trying to avoid the water droplets on it, but there was no real escape. Judging from the records at that time, we know that this problem was almost universal. Farmers could afford glass windows and their cottages are poorly ventilated. When too many people share the same space, the air will become damp and oppressive. The chronicler noticed that the children woke up with wet hair, even though the outside world was cold. You lie here, your scalp wet from the raindrops, and you can almost feel the chill beneath your skin. There is a strange little figure circulating in folk tales. People joke that if you place the dough beside the bed, the steam exhaled by the sleeper can almost help it rise. Is this true? Hardly any, but this exaggeration shows how suffocating the air has become. At the thought of your restless sleep that night turning back into a primitive bakery, you chuckled softly. However, this effect is not always humorous. Dampness is prone to mold. The straw that soaked it and made it moldy. Coughing worsens into an infection. Some modern researchers believe that this cycle of dampness, cold and congestion, is the key reason why winter has become a season of death for farmers. Others, however, counter that farmers accustomed to such an environment have developed resilience that we underestimated. The academic debate remains unresolved, but when you wipe the cold sweat off your forehead, you yourself sense the danger. Your ears can hear some subtle sounds, such as snoring, wheezing, and the whistling of a stuffy nose. You realize that what you are breathing is not the fresh air of the night, but the circulatory output of dozens of lungs. Every sigh carries warmth as well as germs. In this confined space, coughing will not be overlooked. The old man's knocking sound resounded throughout the room again. You understood why diseases spread like fire in the small house in winter. However, there are also undeniable benefits. This mixed breathing creates a microclimate, with a thin layer of warmth, softening the edges of the frost. You rubbed your hands together and noticed that although your fingers were very cold, they weren't frozen stiff. If there were no such gloom of shared exhalation, you might have become numb. Your companion's breathing sustains your life. The children wriggled in their sleep, their cheeks rosy from the damp heat. A pig snorted and exhaled a stream of steam, which mixed with your own steam. For a moment, the entire room was brimming with vitality in a strange and unified way, as if the entire family, whether humans or beasts, shared a huge lung. You listen to its undulations, and the dew drops down like rain. You wonder if people in the Middle Ages also noticed this. Perhaps what they were talking about was the breath of the hut. Perhaps it's a joke. Perhaps it's a curse. We're not sure. There is another strange practice worth mentioning. In some areas, farmers deliberately hang low on the rafters to catch dripping water, more than a wet blanket. Imagine stretching a sheet above your head, a raw ceiling liner, so that ice drops fall on it instead of on your face. Ingenious, if not elegant. You looked up and hoped that the family you were going to visit tonight had done the same. But even the best tricks cannot hide the reality. The night is long, the air is heavy, and the body is both a furnace and a frog machine. Mixed breathing establishes connections, yes, but also blurs boundaries. You might wonder how strange it would be to inhale the warmth of your neighbor's night after night today. However, for them, this is natural and beyond doubt. Survival needs it. Experts still have differences on how farmers view this situation. Are they complaining about the dampness, or do they think it's inevitable and simply ignore it? Some claims suggest that there are complaints about dripping water from houses in folk sayings. Others suggest indifference, as if no one thinks dryness is possible. The truth, just like many times, is hidden in the fog. A drop of water finally landed on your cheek, waking you up again. You took it away, half happy and half annoyed. The child beside you murmured something he couldn't understand and then pulled you closer. You sighed, allowing the warmth of shared breathing to soothe you, even though you felt uncomfortable. Snow is falling from the rafters above, water is dripping steadily, and invisible air clouds are dancing around you, just like the heartbeat of the little house itself. Close your eyes and tell yourself that the morning will bring fresh air, even if the weather is very cold. But now, you are drifting in the steaming tacking, where every breath converges, where warmth and dullness are spreading, where life continues in the midst of a common winter night. You woke up trembling. The blanket slipped down, and a stream of air meandered along your legs like cold fingers. Following the source of the cold, and soon found the culprit minus the window. It feels generous to call it a window. This isn't glass. It's just a hole made in the wall, not much larger than your head. Tonight, someone filled it with rags and wood chips, but the wind still blew in through the gaps. Every gust of wind carries a whistle, weak and sharp. Suddenly, you realize how much of the night is shaped by the struggle against drafts. Archaeologists have confirmed from well-preserved cottages across Europe that most farmers have never seen glass in their entire lives. Some wealthy families use parchment made by scraping or oiling animal horns, transparent enough to allow light to pass through, but these are all luxuries. Most villages manage to survive the winter by blocking their openings with blinds, planks or simple cloths, sacrificed light for warmth. You can imagine that during the day, it must be as dark inside as a cave. All of this is to prevent the endless wind from attacking. You reached out your hand and touched the tattered cloth embedded in the picture frame. They are wet and frozen hard. When you press them, you will feel air seeping in. Every household did their best to stuff moss, straw and even manure into the cracks to block them. A family record from the 15th century mentioned that winter clothes were reserved for windows, worn minus out clothes for ventilation, and for fighting rather than daily wear. You would almost laugh at the idea of using a wardrobe to block a hold. But tonight, feeling the cold fingers caressing your calves, you understand. There is an interesting little note in folk tales that villagers sometimes use fish bladders as temporary curtains. After stretching and drying, they are semi-transparent and can emit in blow while blocking the wind. Imagine sleeping on a herring skin window. It's unlikely to smell good, but it's quite effective. The child beside you is sobbing in his sleep, grasping your arm. You instinctively move your body so that he won't be blown by the wind. This is also part of survival, blocking each other from the cold and creating a barrier between humans and the air. Sleeping positions are not merely for comfort. They are tactics. Grandparents often stand at the edge, children squeeze in the middle, and adults, but just as needed. The tattered cloth in the showcase may collapse, but the walls of the home will hold up. There is still a divergence in the academic community regarding the effectiveness of these draft-proof reading methods. Some scholars believe that such efforts are symbolic and offer psychological comfort rather than physical relief. Others, however, believe that even a slight reduction in airflow could indicate a difference between frostbite and endurance. For centuries, the truth has been hard to measure, but when you squeeze in here, every little piece of cloth seems crucial. The wind blew again, making the frame creak. You imagine the long winter night filled with this sound, the wind moaning endlessly from the imperfect crevices. Medieval literature sometimes personified it. Just as an English folk song goes, the wind sings through the walls. Listen, it does sound like a song, strange and thin, rising and falling with a gust of wind. Perhaps the farmers found a rhythm in it, a lullaby they had never chosen, but they learned to coexist with it. You will think of those noble houses decorated with leaded glass, expensive and fragile, shining in the candlelight behind the stained glass. Compared with this dilapidated hole, those rooms must be very magical. However, even the nobility complained about the sneaky through drafts on their tapestries. In this era, no one can be immune to the invasion of winter. However, for farmers, there is no buffer. The wind and you sleep in the same room, coming uninvited and without mercy. The rag moved again. This time, snowflakes blew and melted on your blanket. You brush them off and your teeth quiver. Someone was stirring on the other side of the room, cursing softly and pressing the frame against another plank. The sound of the hammer echoed for a while, then vanished and was swallowed up by the darkness. Temporary solutions are always temporary. Tomorrow, the snow will fall even heavier and the wind will blow even stronger. People will rush to stuff leftovers into the crevices. There is a strange sense of intimacy in this. Everything in the house, from a tattered coat to the remaining straw, can be part of the fight against the cold. There is no waste. You can imagine that the children are responsible for collecting moss to fill the holes. The mother mends the cloth, and the father prunes the wooden boards. Sampling is not a one-off job. This is a continuous maintenance, as indispensable as taking care of animals or stirring embers. A drop of melted snow falls on your forehead, making your back shiver. You turned around with your back to the window, getting closer to the pile of sleeping corpses. The goat at your feet moved, blocking some of the airflow. You heaved a sigh of relief and silently thanked the animals you had taken pictures of. The whistle continued, though it was softer now because there was an extra plank. You let it blend into the background, reminding you that the cabin is porous and nature always finds a way in. Perhaps this was also part of medieval thought. It's not about conquering winter, but enduring it piece by piece, night after night. Your eyes closed again, hypnotized by the faint sigh of the wind and the warmth of your body. The rags in the showcase may never be perfectly fixed, but they are enough. In this world, survival is enough. Blanch the patchwork blanket and something grabbed your neck. This time it's not straw. This is made of wool. It's thick and coarse and hasn't been washed yet. It scratches like sandpaper, but you still pull it tighter. In the medieval world, the clothes you wore when sleeping were almost no different from those you wore during the day. The corset coat you put on your head in the morning is the same one you wrap around your body in the evening. The pajamas you know don't exist. From the records and wills of the monastery, we know that the basic clothing of farmers was a wooden corset, minus length for men and longer for women. This is usually their only main outfit. When it becomes too thin, they repair it. When it was torn, they spread another piece of rags underneath. At night, farmers only wear corsets. If they have clothes or extra shirts, they might track one around themselves. In colder regions, as a large amount of body heat is lost from there, people will cover their heads with headscarves or scarves. Now you stroke the edge of the hood with your fingers, thanking its rough fabric, although it will sting your skin. In some later records, there is a peculiar practice of stuffing straw into socks or shoes as insulating material. Imagine sleeping with small bundles of straw wrapped around your feet. This is not comfortable, but it can dispel the chill. Tonight your toes are aching from the cold and you almost wish someone would hand you a bundle of hay to trod. Researchers still have differences of opinion on the degree of stratification of farmers' clothing in winter. Wear multiple corsets at a time and only take them off in summer. Others, however, believes that the poor merely lack sufficient textiles. The evidence varies by region. Findings in Scandinavia suggest thicker layers of wool, while the will of British farmers usually only lists one corset. You lie here scratching the itchy fabrics, suspecting that the truth is uneven. Some families have other options. Others have only one set of clothes from birth to burial. Raise your arm and smell it. The smell is a pungent odor of sweat, smoke and the linseed oil of the wool itself. It's very difficult to wash clothes in winter. The water freezes and it takes several days to dry them. More commonly, people brush off dirt or fumigate clothes over the fireplace to kill lice. Your coat carries the smell of sitting by the stove and working in the fields and stables every day. This is a little anecdote from the 15th-century British Family Guide. It suggests that children sleep in simple linen underwear to prevent the wool from being worn out. This indicates that, where possible, people attach so much importance to their outer layers that they take them off at night. A flax is cooler. In a cold cabin, practicality often prevails. Tonight, despite the itching, you insisted on wearing woolen clothes because the idea of taking them off was just too ridiculous. Your thoughts once again wander into the noble room, where there are exquisite linen pajamas and even pleated robes. Some nobles went to bed wearing hats embroidered with embroidery. The contrast is sharp. When you tickle on coarse wool, the nobles complain that silk is too slippery on feather mattresses. However, despite the differences, both the rich and the poor fear the same enemy, that is, the cold. The child curled up beside you is wearing a miniaturized version of the same corset with patches on the elbows. His hair smells of smoke and his breath feels very warm against your chest. You also covered him with your cloak, sacrificing your own comfort for him. This is also part of the night ritual, redistributing the existing small amount of clothing and coverings so that the weakest people can survive. To keep their children alive, parents often endure more cold. Experts still disagree on whether farmers have ever distinguished between night clothing and day clothing. Some people believe that poor villagers must at least occasionally take off their coats to sleep, otherwise the rapid wear of wool will be unsustainable. Others countered that survival is more important than preservation, and most people just live, work and sleep in the same clothes until they decay. Sound of the fireplace about to go out. You lean in the second direction. When frost threatens your toes, keeping warm is more important than the lifespan of the fabric. You scratched your sleeves again, shrinking back because they were too rough. It's hard to imagine that such an itchy coat is a kind of comfort. However, on a cold winter night, it is precious. Scratches on wool may be irritating, but it can insulate, even when damp, stick to heat and last for many years. You realize that every thread on your skin is a small shield in the long battle against winter. The goat moves at your feet, gently pushing your rough legs. At least animals don't complain about the fabric of their long coats. Close your eyes, wrap your cloak tighter, and let the itching disappear in the background noise. Perhaps farmers have never dreamed of pajamas. Perhaps they had accepted the view that sleep is never about softness or comfort, but about endurance. As you gradually fall asleep, you will think that although this coat is very rough, it is the boundary between you and the frost knocking on the door. Your body is restless again in the straw. This time the cold did not come from the through wind or the sliding of the blanket. It stems from an inevitable fact that the pressure between you and others is so great that every position feels temporary. Someone's elbow hit your rib. A child's foot touched your stomach, but whisked your body in an attempt to occupy a space. But as soon as you move, the other body follows suit. This is a strange dance, half unconscious and half deliberate, performed in the darkness of each medieval cottage. The constantly changing sleep schedule. Historical records occasionally describe the form of collective sleeping. In some families, people deliberately roll their bodies into iron chains like spoons, with each person's back pressing against another's, so that heat can be transferred along this line. It's very easy to imagine its rhythm. When one person turns around, the entire chain rolls like a tide. In some other families, sleeping people huddle together, with their feet facing the fire and their heads against the wall, forming a warm circle. Archaeologists studied the patterns of soot on the floor and believed that this arrangement left marks on the straw bedding layer. You lie here, huddled together, and you can almost see the geometric shape of survival being pulled into the ground. There is a peculiar record in a 14th-century French manuscript that describes farmers turning in the fields like oxen. This sounds ironic, but you know it's true. There is a rhythm on this bed. You can't ignore it. The child beside you moved a little. You moved to make room. The old man was out of breath and someone leaned him against the wall. A goat drew closer and everyone adjusted around its body. Sleep is not constant. This is a kind of shared movement. However, this is not random. Families make oral or verbal rules. The younger children are in the middle, the older ones on the edge, and the parents hold them in place. Sometimes, in order to keep warm to the greatest extent, people lie on their heads and feet, with their limbs joined together, and no one's chest is exposed to the air. Although you may try to expand your privacy, you will eventually become a small piece in a larger puzzle. Modern scholars still do not agree on how the sleep pattern was meticulously planned. Some people think this is a daily behavior and a strategy for keeping warm at night. Others, however, believe that people merely collapse to the ground after a few days of hard work, and that order is just formed by habit. The evidence is disheartening. Beds seldom keep secrets, but you suspect that both are true. Strategies exist, but fatigue often determines the final shape. The more bizarre side of these arrangements appears in songs and jokes. One of the ballads marks that after the wife has taken the warm middle position, the husband sits by the sand. Another proverb warns those who sleep on the edge will be awakened by the frost. Remind people that unlucky people who sleep against the wall often freeze stiff. You can show your sympathy tonight. Your shoulders brushed against the mud wall, and the frost bit your skin like tiny teeth. You walked briskly towards the middle without any apology, for the difference between the middle and the edge is like the difference between trembling and warmth. The atmosphere was still very tense. Imagine being crowded among relatives every night, eavesdropping on their snoring, feeling their sweat and smelling their breaths. The boundaries are blurred. Embarrassment has become a common occurrence. A sneeze landed on your face. A cousin was muttering to himself in a dream. The pig is rolling on your leg. At first it felt unbearable, then strangely normal, as if your body had accepted the chaos because there was no other choice. Do you still remember how the monks in the monastery dormitories were lined up in a row, each with their own tray, sometimes separated by low partitions? Contrast is astonishing, public, yet orderly, aiming to suppress the chaos of the body. However, in the farmers' thatched cottages, there is no order other than necessity. The structure is looser, the sense of intimacy is stronger, and the discomfort occurs more frequently. However, both systems have one thing in common. Lunch does not refresh you, it does not energize you. On medieval nights, loneliness was rare and might even have been a danger. As night fell, the event continued. The locked person rolled over and pulled the blanket. Then came a chorus of groans. You will hear murmuring negotiations. Return it to me. I'm cold. Move your feet. Then there was a delay, a sigh, and then an uneasy truce. The next cycle will start in a few minutes. You will understand that sleep here is more about endurance than rest. People do not seek complete peace. They try to hold on until dawn. The body accepts distractions. ADA, PTS to noise and pulsates the elbows. What makes your patients break down after one night is the routine of their entire lives. Experts still have differences of opinion on whether such constant changes will harm sleep quality. Some people think that farmers must be chronically sleep, minus deprived, and their nights are interrupted by exercise and noise. Others counter that the human body might adapt and enter depressed even when disturbed. The truth might lie somewhere in between. Farmers may experience lessened, more intermittent sleep, but they need segmented breaks naps and the necessary recovery ability. The chain has moved again. This time you are sandwiched in the middle, exposed to heat on all sides. Your forehead is covered with beads of sweat, while your toes are cold. You sighed, realizing that you had almost no control. However, there is also a strange kind of consolation. Migrating with family and animals, and becoming part of this turbulent wave, is to share the burden of survival. No one can escape this discomfort. Let's bear it together. A weak wind blew through the patched window. A drop of water landed on your cheek. The old man is coughing. Goats snore. Turn around again, rub your elbow against someone else's back, and react as if you were an organism. Perhaps you might be in a daze thinking that this is the true lesson of medieval nights. Comfort is secondary. Unity is secondary. Sleep is not yours but shared. Every turn of the body, every pull of the blanket, every sigh in the darkness, is part of a larger rhythm. In this rhythm, no matter how awkward it is, there's life. Though you didn't know why. The small room was quiet, with only the snoring of bodies and wild beasts. Then you will notice. The embers in the fireplace had turned pitch black. The faint, orange glow vanished. A deep chill seeped into the room, drifting across the floor like mist. Someone quietly stood up, being very careful not to step on the children. You realized it was their turn to look after the fire. Medieval nights were rarely non-stop. Some villagers call it midnight duty, which is necessary. A fire requires deception. Animals need to be inspected as predators lurk outside. Even inside the house, a family might designate who would get up in the middle of the night to fiddle with the embers, feed the goats, or listen to the troubles. Families without such vigilance might be awakened by frozen water, stiff limbs, or missing cows. You watched that figure squatting by the fireplace, gently blowing on the ashes. The faint beam of light regained its vitality. A few small branches and a wisp of flame emerged. The crackling sounds broke the silence. For a moment, everyone in the room heaved a sigh of relief. As there was very little firewood, the man carefully added a piece of wood and then leaned back in his chair, staring at the tiny firelight. His face was haggard, illuminated by the orange light, and you could feel the weight of responsibility. Contemporary reports sometimes mention this intermittent sleep rhythm. Farmers live by labor rather than clocks. Someone always needs to stir it up. Some historians believe that this vigilance has become a habit, dividing the night into wakefulness and sleep. Others, however, insist that such interruptions are irregular, unnecessary rather than ritualistic. The debate continues. But one thing is clear: 8 hours of non-stop sleep is a modern luxury, not a medieval reality. A strange little anecdote appeared in a 15th century German chronicle. A villager got up in the middle of the night to check on the animals and found a thief squatting by the door trying to drag away a pig. His vigilance saved the family's wealth. Stories like this emphasize why midnight watch is important. Tonight, as you watch this man sitting quietly by the fireplace, you can imagine how many such stories have not been told. Lives saved, disasters avoided, simply because someone woke up at the right time. He didn't go back to bed immediately. Instead, he rested his elbows on his knees and stared at the flames. This is also part of the rhythm. The night is long, longer than modern people can easily imagine. People sometimes use their waking hours to think, pray, or repair tools in the firelight. The monks in the temple hold a formal vigil at midnight. Farmers also have their own irregular festivals. You want to know how many thoughts and how many whispered prayers have been poured into the ashes over the centuries. As soon as he moved, the animals began to move. The cow changed its position and let out a low sigh. The pig pursed. He stood up to check their pens and walked carefully to prevent the children from lying in the straw. It must be very cold outside. He couldn't in the thatched cottage. He couldn't breathe clearly. However, he opened the door a crack, looked out, and then quickly closed it. The wind blew like a blade, curling you up under the blanket. He muttered something, perhaps satisfied that the snow hadn't completely blocked the door, and then returned to the stove. Experts still disagree on whether farmers formally take turns to assume these responsibilities or whether mothers, fathers, or elders habitually do so. Some people think that young people bear most of the burden, allowing children and the elderly to sleep undisturbed. Others point out that there is evidence suggesting that women who breastfeed or look after food often get up at night. It's hard to prove, but you suspect that every family has found its own rhythm. Tonight, in this family, one person shoulders a heavy responsibility. Finally, he lay down again and stuffed himself into the edge of the bed. His movements awakened the chain of the sleeper, and soon the others rolled around, stretched their bodies and lay down again. Such a cycle continues. Sleep has never been absolute. It is layered, fragmented, and shared. When you think of your own night, measured by the alarm clock and daily activities, you marvel at how strange this pattern feels, but when the darkness lasts for 14 hours, it must be so natural. One notable detail is that people sometimes take advantage of midnight shifts to complete tasks that we considered daytime work. A woman might spin a little wool. A person might repair tools, both of which are illuminated by small flames. When the daylight is short, these strange productive forces are meaningful. That night was long. Although most of the time was spent keeping warm, the fragments can be recycled. You imagined extras' fingers working quietly in the sunlight, with family members snoring around them. The flame brightened and then dimmed because it consumed wood. But now it has enough life to last until morning. The sighs of the watcher, curled up into straw. The air quieted down again. You feel a faint warmth spreading outwards quietly, as soft as a sigh. You let it soothe you back to sleep. Perhaps this is one of the quietest ways for farmers to adapt. Accept that sleep comes in turns, accept that there is always someone bearing the weight of wakefulness, and accept that the night is not an enemy to conquer but a trend to control. You took a deep breath of the smoke-filled air coughed, and let the faint crackling sound guide you back to sleep, believing that the next time you were on duty, another person would get up. When you open your eyes again, you don't know how long you have slept. The fire had already burned very low. Although it had not yet completely gone out, the small house felt very quiet, suspended in a strange intermediate state. It's neither night nor morning, but somewhere in between. The body around you is wriggling, no longer as chaotic and restless as before, but at a quieter rhythm. A woman whispers to a child. Someone prayed in a low voice. The old man coughed a few times and then sighed, as if he had breathed a sigh of relief after waking up. You realize that you are experiencing what scholars later call two sleeps. Until the 17th century, evidence in medical literature and diaries described how people across Europe divided their nights. They didn't expect to get a night's sleep. On the contrary, they enter their first sleep after dusk, wake up for 1 or 2 hours at midnight, and then enter their second sleep until dawn. During this period of time they prayed, talked, watched over the fire, inspected the animals, and even visited their neighbors. This is quite normal for them. For you, getting used to being forced to work for 8 hours in one block feels strange, but surprisingly peaceful. Rubbed her eyes. The hut was dim, but not completely dark. The embers still dyed everything a pale red. The silence now is gentler, filled with whispers. There. A boy asked his mother if spring was coming soon. She replied that St. Martin's cloak was spinning quietly as if it belonged only to the night. The child listened, yawned and sank again. You realize that this interval is not merely practical. This is also related to culture. The family fills it with stories, prayers, or simple breaths. There is a strange note in the court record stating that villagers sometimes gather on the street during this period of wakefulness. Imagine walking out into the cold air, seeing the lanterns at other doors shining, and chatting with your neighbors before going home to sleep. This idea seems almost surreal. The night is a public pause rather than an obstacle. However, it occurs frequently enough to draw people's attention. Experts remain divided on whether segmented sleep is observed in farmers across all regions, or is more common in certain climates and cultures. Some people believe that only the educated class has reported this habit, and thus the practice among farmers is more difficult to prove. Others, however, counter that physical evidence suggests that short rest periods and the need to look after fire, animals and children are almost inevitable. When you listen to the whispers in the hut, you will feel that this practice has gone deep into your bones. This is not an imported product. This is very natural. There is a peculiar anecdote in the French medical guidelines of the 15th century, suggesting that the time between the first and second sleep periods should be used to maintain an intimate relationship, which indicates that couples consider this period of pause to be ideal. You chuckled softly, even though you realized that such privacy was impossible in a crowded bed where half of the family members were present. Despite this, the idea still reveals how normal the midnight interval is and even incorporates it into health advice. You were lying on your back staring at the beam on which water droplets were still condensing. In this semi-minus awake state, your mind is more likely to wander. Perhaps this is part of its function, the mental space between day and deep sleep. People pray, meditate, and even plan tasks for the upcoming dawn. In an era when artificial light was scarce, the body followed the rhythm required by the darkness. You can almost feel that your mind is looser than during the day, as if night allows you to wander. Pigs purr in their sleep. The goat turned around and the child asked another question in a low voice in the darkness. This time it's about angels. His mother hummed a tune softly and did not give a complete answer. With the crackling sound of coals, the sound becomes blurred, and you realize that this interval is not only practical but also intimate, a scene hidden in the fabric of the winter night. You will think of modern life, where people stay up late in front of screens and then strive to compress their rest time to 8 hours. Here, the darkness lasted for a long time, and to sleeps seemed inevitable. The middle of the watch is not a waste of time but a part of the rhythm, as natural as the tide. For a long time, scholars have been debating whether this division pattern has gradually disappeared with the rise of artificial lighting, or whether social changes have gradually led people to tend towards longer and more fixed night. There is no definite conclusion yet. It is certain that in such a small house, during the long and harsh winter, in the first and second daily life that felt like sleep, you would sigh and feel your eyelids getting heavier again. The whispers faded away, and the embers became even softer. One family member after another fell into the second round of sleep. This rhythm is as old as the thatch above. You follow behind, tucking yourself into deeper straw and wool, succumbing to the pull of another dream. In this way, the night continued, to sleeps intertwined, pausing at the center of the darkness. The farmers endured it quietly, never doubting that life was just like this. Your eyes opened again. This time it wasn't the cold or the dripping rafters that woke you up. This was a faint bitterness and yeast flavor, wafting across the room. You moved the straw away and noticed that one of the old men was holding a small earthenware cup to his mouth. He poured it back, swallowed a mouthful, sighed, then snorted contentedly and lay down again. You know he drank beer and his einticht before going to bed. For medieval farmers, ale was as common as water. In fact, in many areas, it is safer than water. Brewing can kill some harmful bacteria. Even low concentration malt liquor contains enough calories and is worth drinking. Surviving English family records list malt liquor as a daily supply, measured in gallons rather than cups. Each household brews it themselves or buys a small amount from their neighbors. It is both cheap and filling, and can be bought at any time. In the evening, it becomes even more comfortable. You rubbed your eyes watching the earthenware cup pass from one person's hand to another. The liquid inside is turbid, light brown in color, not thick, and the alcohol content is at most 2%. It is more like liquid bread than a drink in the modern sense. But after a long day and a cold night, it can help people relax. The warmth in your stomach spreads, eliminating the brink of hunger. You took a sip yourself and tasted the sourness mixed with malt, rough, but strangely satisfying. There is a strange little record in the brewing record, showing that some farmers use herbs such as marsh myrtle or rosemary to flavor their malt liquor, giving it a strong reindeer flavor. Tonight, use where use mild a hint of herbs, even though it might just be the smoke from the stove sticking to the cup. In any case, this drink can calm you down and relieve the pain of frost under you. Researchers still do not agree whether farmers drinking beer before going to bed is really a nighttime custom or is only occasionally associated with banquets or heavy work. Some people believe that the evidence of continuous consumption indicates that this is a routine matter. Others pointed out that grains are too valuable to be wasted on random brewing. The truth may vary from village to village. However, sitting here with a cup in hand, you can see the appeal of the night talent show. Hunger and cold will subside, even if only a little. The child beside you is stirring. A mother is dipping her finger in malt liquor and rubbing it against his lips. He gave a puff and then fell asleep again. At first you will be shocked, but you will remember that in a world without clean water and plenty of milk, light beer is a common drink, even for children. It provides heat and calories, and no one will consider it. The atmosphere of the small house changes with every bite. The old man hummed softly. It was a snippet of a song from a certain festival. Another adult giggled and whispered a joke that you couldn't understand. Even in the smoke-filled darkness, the bitterness of ale seems to be relaxing. At that moment, the heavy burden of winter vanished. You can see that this simple drink is more than just nutritious. This is a consolation for despair. An anecdote in medieval folklore even warns that people who sleep without drinking beer will dream of wolves. Is this superstition or merely a reminder of how important this drink is to their comfort? Experience it yourself tonight. Without the faint warmth of beer in the stomach, the cold would be even more chilling. With it, you will find it easier to adapt to straw. However, there are also limitations. Too much malt liquor. Court records occasionally mention that fights would break out of the village when beer houses were served late. Some pastors rebuke the parishes for being extremely lazy and warned that excessive indulgence would breed sin. Even in a private cabin, drinking too much can lead to quarrels among those sharing a bed. But in this family, taking a small sip quietly does not cause inflammation. It soothes. You tossed and turned under the blanket, your eyes heavy, feeling the warmth of the beer lingering on. Around you, the breathing of the thatched cottage becomes harmonious and gentle again, as if the drink has brought everyone into a peaceful rhythm. Even the pigs seem to sigh contentedly and curled up tightly on the straw. You might think that beer is not merely for safety and making a living. Perhaps this is also a kind of ritual, a way to end the day, marking a pause between wake-up signals and the second sleep. A small bite distilled hunger, a mouthful swallowed calm thoughts, and a warm feeling brought into the dream. You curled up even deeper, the blanket scratching your chin, and closed your eyes again. Eye faints, our malt flavor lingers on your tongue. The wind is howling outside. You drift inside, stabilized by the oldest new farmers wearing night hats. You were awakened and grabbed your own arm. The itch is persistent, sharp and maddening. You sat in the straw, brushing your sleeves. But it felt worse and worse. You, feeling dazed and confused, suddenly realized that this was not an illusion. This is a life with bedbugs, lice and fleas. The night companion of farmers across Europe. Medieval works, including sermons and family manuals, talked about pests on the bed as if it were an insignificant fact in life. Archaeologists have even discovered the fossils of fleas on layer upon layer of straw beds, and their small shells have been preserved like terrifying souvenirs. You scratched again and realized how long minus lasting the stimulus was. Never completely absent, always waiting in the dark. One detail we learned from the surviving remedies is that people resisted with herbs. In every household, bundles of mugwort, rosewood flowers or royal pennies were burned in the fireplace, allowing the smoke to drift through the bedding. It is said that this smell can drive away pests. You glanced at the beam of the house, where a bunch of withered leaves hung, and a faint bitter taste wafted through the air. This is not perfume. This is pest control. It is still uncertain whether it really works. Some historians believe that it only offers psychological comfort, while others think that the strong oil in this plant does indeed drive away insects to a certain extent. But tonight, you still have to scratch. A strange little flower border is recorded in a German family guide. One suggestion is to sprinkle the ashes in the straw to create a texture that fleas don't like. Imagine lying on a bed filled with soot. This kind of thought will make you frown. However, moments of despair required desperate measures to be taken. Your companion has also woken up. A child scratched his scalp and rubbed his head against the blanket. An old woman's figure, muttering that the bugs were very active tonight. Such comments are quite normal. Pests are not a disgrace but something annoying. Even monasteries and nobles complained about lice, which prove that no class could escape. Experts still disagree on just how destructive pests are. Some people think that these noises are tolerable background noises that people will hardly notice after enduring through many years. Others, however, insist that their contribution to illness and fatigue far exceeds what the records have acknowledged. The truth might lie somewhere in between. But they are ruthless and can deplete health over time. Do you still remember reading about some families deliberately smoking in bed and hanging straw bags above the fireplace to let the smoke kill the insects? The result was that a big fire broke out on the bed, but it wasn't as active. When you inhale the smoky air here, you will wonder if this family has done the same thing. The faint smell of charred straw clung to the blanket. Another peculiar and charming remedy is to sprinkle fragrant seeds such as fennel or lavender around the bedding. Whether effective or not, it at least offers a sweeter scent to mask the stench of sweat and animals. Tonight, you imagine a faint lavender scent passing through the mosque in the barnyard. For a moment, the small house almost made people feel very comfortable. You scratched again and your nails got stuck in the seam of your coat. The itching won't stop. You know this is the true rhythm of a medieval night, right? It's not silence, but constant anger. The family members groped, adjusted, sighed and accepted in the darkness. This has never been a matter of conquering insects, but a matter of coexisting with them. A folktale even claims that fleas are little torments that God reminds us of humility, keeping humans away from pride. Perhaps this belief makes the bite more bearable. Or perhaps this is just a way of laughing through discomfort. No matter what, the bite goes on, and so does life. The pig snorted and scratched around the wall. You fight alongside animals. A child moaned, patted his legs, and then curled up in the straw. Ultimately, exhaustion overcame everything. You lay down, still itchy, but too tired. Close your eyes and you might think that perhaps resilience is not about defeating pests, but about stubbornly choosing to sleep no matter what. Just like this, you scratched, sighed, resigned yourself to fate, and once again fell into an uneasy dream. You moved again in the straw, but your skin was still pricked by the flea. The air in the small house now feels a little warmer, though not because the fire has flared up again. This is because someone pulled a sheet over the bed, forming a thin barrier that more effectively blocked heat than before. Realizing what you saw. This is a temporary canopy. A rope is hung from one wall to the other, with cloth hanging on it, dividing part of the sleeping space. For farmers, even the simplest curtains can change the winter night. Sometimes in the inventory list of an ordinary family, there is a kind of bedding fabric listed, not for decoration but for practical use. Curtains, even those made of rough linen or patched wool, can block the wind and keep warm. It also creates a private shadow in the room, otherwise dozens of eyes would see everything. Now slide under it and notice how quickly the trapped breathing thickens the air. There was a strange little anecdote in the 15th century. Eamon boasted that his wife had sewn a canopy from an old coat, claiming that it made their cottage as warm as a noble's room. This kind of boasting might be a bit exaggerated, but its principle is reasonable. Even thin fabrics can play an insulating role. Tonight, you can feel the difference. The cold wind outside the window has weakened, and it seems that your body around you is dissipating heat more effectively within this small enclosure. Experts are still debating how common this kind of bed curtain is among farmers. Some scholars believe that they are rare luxuries and more common in wealthier families, while others think that resourceful families put them together on the spur of the moment with any extra fabric. Archaeological discoveries are rare because few fabrics have been preserved. but the idea itself is very simple, and you would suspect that many people have tried it. You turn sideways and the fabric brushed against your cheek. It has the smell of smoke and lanolin. It's hard to be pleasant, but it blocks the view of the wet rafters. All of a sudden, the room feels smaller, more enclosed, and more yours. In a space without privacy, this piece of fabric creates a boundary, no matter how thin it is. You can imagine that in a noble family, thick embroidered curtains enclose the entire bed, so effectively retaining heat that the person sleeping there will sweat even in the middle of the night. In contrast, your single rope and patched bedsheets seem insignificant. However, the principle is the same. Fabric serves as armor against winter. In some rural areas, there is a strange custom of hanging a child's baptism cloth on the bed for good luck. Whether it is to drive away ghosts or merely to show respect for tradition, it adds another layer of meaning to the curtain. Bedtime is never just a physiological matter. It is brimming with ritual and symbolic meanings. Tonight you want to know if the rope-hanging cloth at home is practical. Perhaps this is also a kind of charm. Listen carefully. Outside the tree canopy, you can still hear goats walking, pigs humming and grandfather coughing. But inside, the sound is deep, as if the fabric had created its own world. It's easier to sleep in this cocoon. Perhaps this is also part of its appeal. The illusion of separation, the tranquility amid chaos. Experts remain divided on whether these temporary awnings really increase warmth, or whether they offer more psychological benefits. Some people think that the difference in temperature is very small. Others point out that modern experiments show that even thin barriers can significantly reduce airflow. The fact might be both. This piece of cloth adds a touch of comfort and a great sense of security to people. You stretch out your arm and brush the fabric again. You feel its fragility. It is very easy to tear, and each patch requires years of repair. However, the care in these stitches is profound. Every household spends time sewing because every bit of warmth is important. Imagine a mother sewing rags by the fire at dusk, knowing that her work will help her children get through another cold night safely. The child beside you rolled closer and burrowed into your chest. His breathing blared the air inside the tree canopy. Wrap the edge of the cloth around both of you and seal up the small tent. For a moment, you felt that the outside world, wolves, snow, thieves and endless darkness could not approach you. You know this is an illusion, but illusions can be very powerful. Perhaps this is what farmers desire most on winter nights. It's not perfect comfort that's impossible, but a little defense. A rope with cloth, a small piece of fur, and a shared blanket. None of them can completely solve the problem of cold, but together they make endurance possible. Clench your eyes and let the dull air surround you. The fleas are still bite you. The smoke is still rising. And the wind is still sighing by the window. However, within this patchwork canopy, you will feel a vulnerable refuge. When you go with the flow, you may think that perhaps luxury is never gold or velvet, but a rare gift that allows you to sleep through the night without shivering. You sank deeper, half asleep and half awake. At this moment, another voice burst into the village's hustle and bustle from outside the smoke-filled wall. It was blurry at first, and then clearer. A dog was barking somewhere in the alley, and another dog in the distance responded. A rooster was confused by the faint glow of the embers and crowed prematurely. From the other side of the hut, a low voice came from the beer house, swaying, laughing so loudly that you once again realized how thin these walls were. The farmers' cottages were not built for sound insulation. Wattle and daub porous. Sound from the thatch truth seems to be nothing but woven grass. Every quarrel among the neighbors, every singing at midnight, and every tapping of the bucket reverberated. Court records from rural England even mentioned that villagers complained of noise at night, with neighbors shouting or singing loudly after dark. You can now hear a man's voice, indistinct, trying to keep the tone. His wife scolded him, her sharp tone almost as clear as if she were standing right in the room. An interesting detail in folk tales is that people use dog barking as an informal clock. If a dog makes a chorus, It usually means that a stranger is passing by or an animal is wandering around. Tonight, the dog's restless barking hinted at these 2 points. You can imagine a fox near the chicken coop or a thief sneaking around the fence. The family began to stir restlessly. Everyone listened. In the darkness, even distant sounds can make people feel threatened. Scholars still disagree on whether the countryside is a truly quiet place or an unusually noisy one. Some people believe that without modern industry, the night must be quiet, with only the sounds of nature. Others countered that the close-minded life, animals and public life, kept the village noisy all the time. The fact might be that both exist. The fields are silent, while the alleys are noisy. For you lying in this little house, the noise is undeniable. The pig beside you will purr in response to the outside noise. The goat raised its head, its ears twitching, and then sat down again. A child muttered to himself, asking if there were any wolves nearby. His mother replied in a low voice that it was just because the neighbor had drunk too much. This comfort was calm, although you noticed her hand tightly grasping the blanket, seeming me to bring everyone closer. A collection of medieval proverbs preserves a strange little anecdote: walls have ears, and roofs have tongues. This sentence reveals the reason why the village house never keeps secrets. Every whisper may be heard by someone. Every sound came out. You will hear the truth tonight. When the drunk singer tripped and cursed, the entire alley seemed to be laughing. That sound rippled through the village like water. You move under the tree canopy, thinking about how little privacy exists, not only inside the hut but also outside it. Everyone knows when a family is quarreling, when a cow is calving, and when a child is crying at night. The sound of one house is the sound of all houses. Perhaps this gave birth to the community, connecting people together through constant awareness. This breeds resentment, and every family is enraged by each other. Historians are still debating whether this closeness promoted harmony or led to constant friction. You suspect both. The rooster crowed again, stubborn and persistent. Someone outside threw a stone and shouted for quiet. The bird paused for a moment and then chirped proudly. You hid under the blanket and chuckled gently, realizing that even centuries ago the battle between humans and the noisy rooster was eternal. The dogs became quieter and quieter, and their barks turned into occasional roars. The alley was almost silent, although the drunkard's snoring was now faintly echoing in front of his door. You imagine him falling outdoors rather than indoors, and you wonder if his wife will leave him there until morning. In the small house, the family settled down again. The child's questions about wolves have always been lingering in your mind. In fact, there is indeed danger outside the wall. Wolves, thieves, and even marauders in harsh times. But the greater threat often comes from the villagers who return after attending the banquet. Nights in the Middle Ages were not merely indifferent. They are unpredictable and pierced through by the foolish voices of humans. You turn over sideways, listening to the creaking sound of the straw beneath your feet, and let the deep sound wash over your body. Every bark, every cry, every intoxicating song reminds you that this little house is not isolated, but woven into a living village. Walls may be thin, but the boundaries between lives are also thin. Perhaps you are drowsy thinking, this is both a curse and a consolation. One can never fall asleep in true silence, nor can one fall asleep alone. Villages always exist. Even in the dead of night, they hum, reminding you that survival is shared by all. The rooster crowed again, looking down on others. Letting fatigue drag you back. The noisy chorus of medieval nights gradually fades away from your dreams. The rooster crowed again. You moved a little, but this time it was a different sound, the creaking of the wheels, distant but clear. Somewhere nearby a handcart was being pulled along a frosty path. Its screeching pierced through the darkness of the early morning. You pulled the blanket higher, trying to keep it out, but that sound reminded you of something else. Not everyone in the village sleeps like you. Somewhere, a magic house could be faintly seen. Its owner and wife were also asleep, or perhaps awake. However, their nights were shaped by a very different kind of beg. Memorial records and surviving furniture show that the wealthier farmers lived in huts with at least 2 rooms, and sometimes even an upper attic. Their beds might be made of wood instead of straw laid on the floor, with linen sheets and wool blankets on top. But the real contrast comes when you climb up the social ladder and see the manor itself. The room is furnished with elaborately carved oak beds, on which tapestries are hung and mattresses filled with feathers, hemp or down are laid. Such a bed seems unimaginable. However, even in those tall rooms, comfort cannot be guaranteed. The stone wall gave off a cold air like a cellar. The through wind slips through the blinds. The fire in the hall only warmed those near the fireplace. Some nobles even complained that although it was very luxurious, frost still formed inside. Hearing this, you almost laughed. A nobleman might sleep under a silk sheet, but when he wakes up his breathing is still murky. A strange little note appeared in a satirical poem of the Middle Ages. A nobleman was ridiculed because there were 3 mattresses around him and the feather bed was piled up very high, but he still complained that his nose froze at night. This painting is very funny, just like a frog standing on a pile of water lilies, but it reveals the truth. Even wealth cannot conquer winter. In terms of sleep, researchers still have differences of opinion on the extent of the gap between peasants and lords. Some people believe that the nobles did enjoy greater comfort, while others emphasize that cold was the greatest equalizer. Both of these viewpoints have their merits. Tonight, as you scratch flea bites in the smoggy hut, you admit that you'd rather try a down bed, but you know that in that well-minus ventilated place, a nobleman is also sneezing at the frost, which comforts you. However, this difference is not merely physical. The bed itself symbolizes status. In the will, the noble bed frame was listed as a precious family heirloom and sometimes passed down from generation to generation. Farmers seldom mention their problems. Straw is too short minus leave to be considered wealth, for you have to endure clumping and pests. The nobles displayed carved colours, embroidered curtains and even locks on the bedrooms. Sleep is not merely a necessity. This is a manifestation of power. You can imagine sneaking into such a room now. Tapestries hung on the wall, the candles burned very low, and the wrinkled cover was as heavy as armor. Could it be warmer than this smoke-filled little house? Perhaps. But would this make people feel safer? Not necessarily. Theft records show that even etiquette can be attacked, the silk and feathers can be stolen, wealth can be in danger, and the only defense against poverty is that there is nothing worth stealing. Another peculiar tradition of the rich is to tightly draw the test bed frame with curtains. This cocoon can keep warm, suppress sounds and block air currents. For farmers, the closest thing is the rope cloth you dragged before. This difference is in degree rather than in type. Both the poor and the rich long for the same thing, a barrier against winter. Scholars still have differences of opinion as to whether farmers envy the comfort of the nobility or helplessly accept their own fate. The jealousy must be very intense. Others point out that in folktales, rich sleepers are ridiculed for their laziness, which indicates a mixture of admiration and contempt. Perhaps the truth is that complex jealousy is softened by humor, and bitterness ferments through acceptance. The wheels outside are creaking again. You can imagine that the servants have already gotten up and started a fire in the manor. Their masters might wake up late, stretching on the down bed, but the work of maintaining luxury has never ceased. Sleep is never completely private. It relies on others. The servants tended the fire, patted the mattresses and brought in warm stones to stuff into the quilts. You smile and realize that in some respects, farmer smoke huts are more honest. You can do it with what you have. No fantasy. The rooster crowed again. The sound spread throughout the small house and also through people's manners. At that moment you saw symmetry. Rich or poor, everyone is awakened by the same bird, chilled by the same wind, and threatened by the same winter. The gap between the straw and the feather is real, but not infinite. Coughs, snores and mournful prayers echoed in both the hut and the hall. You sat back on your straw, absent-mindedly grasping at it. Perhaps comfort is relative. A lord cursed his cold nose. You curse your flea bites. Both of them endured, waiting for the dawn. Perhaps you think that sleep itself is a great equalizer. No matter what bed one is in, everyone must close their eyes and believe that another night will pass and another morning will come. You woke up again, this time hearing footsteps by the fireplace. Those familiar figures still curled up in the straw were not family members but strangers. Lum must have knocked at the door earlier. Now two people have come in, stomping the snow off their boots. Traveler. Their cloaks were stiff from the frost and their faces were pale in the afterglow. Without hesitation, the family made room, lifted the edge of the blanket and signaled them to come closer. You blinked in surprise, but then realized, in such a village, hospitality is indispensable. Written records from memorial courts and church registrations often mention that strangers share the same floor, the same straw, and sometimes even the same blanket. The road was bumpy, its seldom rained and the nights were long. Risk being exposed to death. The community is well aware of this, so the main gate is at most slightly bolted and is often open to outsiders. This is survival and also an obligation. Refusing asylum may bring disgrace and, in some areas, may also result in a fine. The travelers knelt by the stove, holding faint coal lumps in their hands. As the snow melted, steam emerged from their boots, and the room was filled with a damp smell. The pig gurgled restlessly. The goat barked, but soon both animals quieted down, not realizing the threat. The family offered the newcomer stock honor. A few minutes later, they lay down too, still wearing their cloaks and dadding their tangled warm quilts. A peculiar anecdote emerged in the 14th-century British chronicles. A beggar was allowed to live in a small house. Later, he was accused of stealing a spoon before dawn. The case ended with fines and gossip, but it shows how fragile trust can be. Tonight, you will notice how carefully this family has stuffed their little items. A wooden bowl, a knife close to oneself, and then close one's eyes. Generous, yes, but never naive. Researchers still do not agree whether this spatial sharing is continuous or occasional. Some people think that country cottages often receive travelers, while others believe that this situation is limited to the desperate winter. A lack of written records left a void, but in the bone-chilling cold of this small house, this logic is undeniable. Survival often means sharing whether you like it or not. Newcomers move around you, and their breathing makes the air murky, blending with the already thick, damp mist inside. You feel their cloaks brushing against yours, and the rough wool is wrapped in snow. They gave off the smell of horse sweat and smoke, both strange and familiar. Every traveler in this world has the same feeling. The child beside you murmured a question. "Are they good people?" his mother whispered. "On a cold night, all people are children of God." This was a hopeful rather than a definite answer, but the boy accepted it and then fell asleep again. He slept longer, listening to the faint breathing of strangers, wondering how many such nights the village had gone through. Safety and compassion are at stake. In some parts of Germany, there is a peculiar folk belief. Every household was told to welcome guests on winter nights in case Christ came in disguise. This is not only charity, but also mental insurance. Refusal may mean a curse. Their faces softening in their sleep, you wondered if the farmers regarded each guest as both a danger and a potential blessing. When a stranger moved and pulled the blanket higher, the straw rustled. Warmth spread further among the piles of corpses. In fact, more corpses often mean more comfort. That in doubt cannot offset the actual benefits. Perhaps this is why resentment is set aside and why even rivals might share a bed on such a night. Experts still have differences of opinion on farmers' views of this arrangement. Some people think they are disgusted by such disturbances, while others believe it is the natural law of things. Since the poor have no diaries, it is impossible to be sure. However, when you feel the warmth seeping from these strangers, you may wonder that when the frost crackles the blinds, gratitude is stronger than resentment. The hut fell silent again. Outside, the snow was piling up higher and higher, and the world was silent. Indoors, family members and travelers merge into a breathing organism. You close your eyes and realize that in this vulnerable place, what survival requires is not high walls but the willingness to let others in. Perhaps this is the clearest lesson. In the winter nights of the Middle Ages, trust was not an abstract virtue but a tool against death. It's not stupid to sleep beside a stranger. Sometimes this is the only way to wake up at dawn. The little house is now quiet, but your thoughts have completely drifted to another place. You imagine the faint chimes ringing in the distance. But those of the countryside, but those of the monastery. When you are half asleep and half awake, the smoky straw floor gives way to the stone floor. The farmers' idle talk was replaced by the restrained silence of the monks. You find yourself imagining that winter nights are not spent in crowded cabins but in corridors, where sleeping is also a kind of training. The monastic regulations such as those of Saint Benedict describe how the monks slept in large dormitories. Rows of narrow pallets were spread out on the cold stone floor. Each monk lies in his own space, usually dressed. The blanket was very thin, the wool was roughened, it lacked fire. Austerity was intentional. Consolation is regarded as a sin of temptation. In some monasteries, monks even sleep upright in their chairs to prevent themselves from becoming lazy. Thinking of this, you couldn't help shivering and realize that even your thorny straw bed seemed too indulgent compared to such a harsh environment. An interesting note appeared in Sitter's record. Novices are required to wear belts when sleeping and not to take off their clothes. Their idea is that even during breaks, vigilance must never be relaxed. As soon as the bell rang, they were ready to get up for the midnight prayer. Tonight, when you imagine yourself lying in such a tomb chamber, you can hear the faint, metallic chimes reverberating in the stone hall. But austerity comes at a cost. The chronicles complained that the ink in the writing room had frozen and frost had formed on the monks' blankets. Some people got chilblains, while others got lung diseases. Modern scholars debate whether such extreme denial strengthens faith or merely damages the body. Some people believe that monks have gained resilience through self-minus discipline. All others seize the suffering disguised as piety. The evidence did not provide a single answer, which left the debate unresolved. However, this place forms a sharp contrast with your smoke-filled little house. In the village, corpses huddled together to keep warm. In the monastery, distance and discipline are more important. However, both of these fields are confronted with the same challenges. A long winter night without proper insulation. You grab your arm and then imagine a monk doing the same. Sitting straight against the wall, wearing a woolen cloak. There is a strange little story circulating in a Benedictine monastery in France. It is said that monks wear shoes when they sleep so that they can get up quickly to keep watch at night. This story might be a bit exaggerated, but it implies people's expectation that they are always ready. Thinking of still struggling to lie in bed with your boots tied up makes you chuckle softly. But perhaps it's true. The air is colder in your view. Stones do not store heat like soil and straw. The air currents lit along the corridor, and the chanting sound lingered even in the silence. The difference is that the monks chose this kind of life. Farmers had to fight in the cold, while monks regarded it as spiritual training. You want to know which is more difficult, patience without choice or patience because of loyalty. Some researchers believe that the monastic discipline regarding sleep has influenced a broader culture. Villagers living near the monastery might have absorbed the idea of segmented nights or night prayers. Others, however, believe that this influence is negligible and limited to the lives of the clergy. Just like many things in the medieval world, certainty slips through your fingers like smoke. But tonight, you can feel a resonance. Whether in the thatched cottage or the monastery, the winter nights have engraved themselves in their bodies and souls. Both farmers and monks woke up at midnight, though for different reasons. One was to stir the embers, and the other was to sing hymns. Both of them endured the cold, although one fought against it with goats and pigs and the other with prayer. You blink and the stone disappears. The smoke-filled hut is back. The straw stings your back, and animals move around nearby. However, you carry the echoes of another world. It reminds us that sleep in the Middle Ages was never simple, never soft, and was always shaped by responsibility, faith, or pure survival. You sighed and pulled the blanket higher, at least glad that your body was close to you. The monks may have chosen simplicity, but you in the little houses should be grateful to every goat, pagan child who shares the heat with you. Perhaps this is the most genuine difference. Monks seek holiness and suffering. Farmers seek life. In the endless darkness of winter, they all find what they need in their own ways. You came and went in a half-awake, half-asleep state until a tremor woke you up. This time it wasn't because the straw got damp, nor was it due to flea bites. This is an illusion in your mind. A room larger than the small house you once slept in. The walls are stone towering above you. The tapestries hung like huge carpets, protecting against the cold, and their colors dimmed in the darkness. You realize that you have left the misty farmhouse, at least in your imagination, and entered a castle. It is easy for people to think that life behind the castle wall is pure luxury. A bed frame carved from oak. The mattress was stuffed with feathers and the fur on the body was layered upon each other. Among the existing list of noble families, bedding is as luxurious as jewelry. Imported linen, velvet duvet covers, and padded bed sheets. Sounds like paradise. But no matter how magnificent a stone is, it is colder than mud. Tonight, lying in this imagined room, you will feel the through wind sliding through the headib or cracks, seeping through the gaps of the blinds, and crawling on the floor like an invisible snake. An interesting story comes from a French noblewoman in the 14th century. She complained that when she woke up, she found frost inside the curtains. Think about it. Even surrounded by silk curtains and a thick leather coat, her breathing still froze. The contrast between glory and hardship is almost ridiculous. You grabbed your own arm, realizing that frost didn't care whether you were wearing a man-made shirt or a woolen one. Experts hold different opinions on how effective the noble sleep arrangement is. Some people believe that the layered curtains and feather beds do indeed create comfortable pockets. Others, however, stress that no matter how magnificent and well-ventilated a hall is, it is hard to feel warm. The evidence supports both. Wealth worked, but winter was stubborn. There are still unimaginable luxuries in the farmers' thatched cottages. Nobles sometimes used warm bed pots, sliding metal trays filled with embers under the bedding to preheat the sheets. Now imagine one where, when the servant carefully places it under the mattress, it emits a faint light. The danger of sparks igniting linen is real, but this practice still exists. For farmers, the closest alternatives are hot bricks wrapped in cloth and warm bodies of cattle. Both of these strategies, whether noble or humble, tell the same story. No one likes to climb onto a cold quilt. A peculiar piece of gossip comes from a castle in Scotland. It is reported that some families keep dogs called comfort dogs, which sleep specifically at the foot of the bed. Their warmth, rather than the bed, is the true treasure. You can imagine a lady in a castle draping fur over her shoulders and stepping on a fluffy little daub to thank it for its warmth. You chuckled in the smoke-filled thatched cottage. Farmers have pigs and goats. Doubles have hunting dogs. Everyone tries their best to borrow warmth. The sounds here are also different. What you hear is not the gurgling of pigs, but the low groans of wood and the howling of the wind through the arrow crevices. The guards on the battlements, their footsteps echoing downstairs. The cold here feels even stronger, but it's still bone-chilling. You know that the nobles can also tolerate noise and unease, but in a different way. Historians have been debating whether noble families all slept in the same room, or if privacy really kept them apart. Some records show that